Welcome to our deep dive into Master Your Emotions. I gotta say, I was really intrigued by the author's admission in the beginning about how writing this book was a total emotional roller coaster for him. Like, come on, it's kind of ironic, right? It makes you feel like, okay, this is going to be a relatable read.
Yeah, definitely. I think it really underscores the fact that we all struggle with emotions,
Yeah.
even the people who write the books on mastering them right.
Totally. So, what's the big takeaway here? Like, what's the foundation the whole book is built on?
Well, the author is really trying to drive home this point that you are not your emotions.
Yeah.
They're not like a permanent part of you. They're more like temporary visitors just passing through.
Okay, I get that. But like when you're really in it, Like when you're feeling super angry or sad, it sure feels pretty permanent.
Right, and that's where the book gets super practical. It points out that we often use the word feel when we actually mean think.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like we say, I feel like this situation is unfair. But what we really mean is, I think the situation is unfair, and that makes me angry.
Oh my gosh, that is so true. I do that all the time.
We all do. It's like we're
Ugh.
trying to intellectualize our feelings instead of actually feeling them.
Exactly. And the book is saying that makes it even more intense because we're not really dealing with them directly.
That's right.
So instead of just thinking our way out of emotions, what does the book say we should do?
Well, it encourages us to pay attention to the physical sensations of emotions.
Okay.
So instead of thinking I'm stressed, you actually notice the tightness in your chest or that shallow breathing, the tension in your shoulders.
Interesting. So we're like tuning into our bodies instead of the mental chatter.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the book goes on to talk about all sorts of factors that can impact our emotional state.
Like what?
Well, it starts with something we all could use more of: sleep.
Ugh, tell me about it. When I don't get enough sleep, like everything bugs me.
Yeah, right. The book actually cites a study. It found that most people struggling with anxiety or depression, they were getting less than 6 hours of sleep.
Wow, that's scary.
And get this, the book says that sleep deprivation costs the U.S. economy over $400 billion every year.
Okay, that's a serious wake-up call, literally.
Right. So besides sleep, the book has some pretty interesting things to say about exercise. Not just for our physical health, but for our mood, too.
Oh, really?
It actually says that for some folks, exercise can be just as effective as antidepressants.
Wow, that's amazing. How does that work?
It talks about how exercise releases endorphins. Those have mood-boosting effects. And there's this great story about a researcher. He basically created a depressed persona for himself. It was to evaluate mental health facilities.
No.
So to get into that depressed state, he did things like slouching, talking negatively, and he avoided any physical activity.
Interesting.
But then to bring himself back, he had to force himself to move and get active.
That's a powerful example of the whole mind-body connection. So it sounds like taking care of our physical well-being, that's a huge part of managing our emotions. But what about like the internal stuff, like our thoughts and beliefs?
That's where the book gets into dopamine and the whole one day I will myth.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's that idea that we're constantly chasing happiness, believing that once we achieve that next goal, then we'll finally be happy.
Oh, yeah, I know that trap.
But the book is saying that's not how it works. Real happiness isn't a destination. It's more like an ongoing journey.
Okay, I like that. But if chasing external rewards doesn't lead to lasting happiness, what does?
Well, the book talks about this study from back in 1978. They compared lottery winners to people who'd become paraplegics.
Wow.
And what's really interesting is that both groups, they went back to their baseline level of happiness after about a year.
Wait, so winning the lottery doesn't make you happy?
Not permanently, at least.
Yeah.
The book calls this hedonic adaptation. It basically means that we get used to new situations, good or bad, and our happiness levels tend to go back to a set point.
That makes you think. So if it's not external achievements, then what is it? What actually determines our happiness?
The book cites a researcher named Sonja Lyubomirsky. She says that happiness is about 50% genetics, 40% internal factors, and only 10% external factors.
Wow. So we actually have a lot more control over our happiness than we think.
Exactly. And that's where understanding the ego comes in, which is what the book dives into next.
All right, let's talk about the ego. But before we do, I'm super curious to hear your take on that whole hedonic adaptation thing. I mean, it's a pretty mind-blowing concept.
It really is. It challenges everything we think we know about happiness. And it actually ties in perfectly with the ego, because that's usually what's behind that endless chase for external validation.
Okay, so how does this book define the ego? Is it just about being like arrogant or self-centered?
It's a little more nuanced than that. The book says that the ego is basically the self-identity we create. It's that voice in our head that's constantly comparing, judging, always looking for approval.
So it's like the story we tell ourselves about who we are,
Yeah.
which might not actually be the whole truth.
Exactly. And the book talks about how the ego tries to make that story stronger. It uses things like material possessions, our physical appearance, relationships, even strongly held beliefs.
It's crazy how the book links the ego to consumerism. Like, think about how much advertising plays on our insecurities, making us feel like we need to buy stuff to be happy. It's all about feeding the ego.
Oh, for sure. And the problem is when we tie our self-worth to those external things, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment because those things are always changing and they're not really in our control.
Right. It's like building your happiness on a foundation of sand.
Exactly.
It's bound to crumble eventually.
That's why the book really emphasizes understanding how the ego plays into our emotions.
Right.
And once we see how it works, we can start to detach from it and create a more solid sense of self-worth that comes from within.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we actually change those deep-seated emotional patterns? It seems kind of daunting.
Yeah, it's definitely a process, not a quick fix.
Yeah.
But the book gives us this really helpful framework for understanding how those strong emotions develop in the first place.
Okay, I'm all ears.
It's a simple formula. Interpretation plus identification plus repetition equals strong emotion.
Okay, let's break that down. What do you mean by interpretation?
It's basically how we assign meaning to events,
Yeah.
based on our beliefs, experiences, filters.
Yeah.
It's like our own unique lens for seeing the world.
So two people could have the same experience, but have completely different emotional reactions because they're interpreting it through their own lens.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then there's identification. That's when we get caught up in the thought or emotion
Yeah.
and start believing that it is us. We lose that sense of separation, that awareness that we're just observing the emotion not being it.
Oh, I get it. It's like we merge with the emotion instead of seeing it as a temporary wave.
Exactly. And then we have repetition. That's where we dwell on the same thoughts over and over again.
Yeah.
It just strengthens those neural pathways.
Ugh, that sounds like a recipe for misery. So how do we stop doing that? How do we break free from that cycle?
Well, the book talks about the importance of letting go.
Mm.
And it emphasizes that this is a practice, not a one-time fix. It also introduces this technique from the Sedona method. It involves asking yourself a series of questions whenever you're feeling stuck in a negative emotion.
Okay, what are the questions?
They're actually really simple. Could I let this feeling go? Would I? When? It's all about realizing that you have a choice in how you react to your emotions.
I like that. Puts you back in the driver's seat.
Right. And then the book gets into how we can intentionally cultivate more positivity.
Okay.
It's based on the idea that what you think about most, you become.
Uh-huh.
So if we focus on positive thoughts, we'll create more positive emotions.
Isn't that just like naive, positive thinking, though? Life isn't always sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah, the book acknowledges that. It's not about denying the negative or pretending everything is perfect. It's more about managing those negative emotions when they come up. But also being proactive about nurturing a more positive state of mind.
Okay, that makes more sense. So what are some practical ways to do that? How do we cultivate more positivity?
Well, the book talks about the power of gratitude. Even something as simple as appreciating a beautiful object or keeping a gratitude journal can make a big difference.
Oh, I love that. It's so easy to focus on the negative. But gratitude can really shift your perspective.
Right. And then there's visualization. The book suggests imagining your ideal day in vivid detail.
I've heard about that. It's like giving your brain a taste of happiness.
Exactly.
Yes.
The book also emphasizes self-esteem boosters, like acknowledging your accomplishments no matter how small they seem, and really making an effort to accept compliments graciously.
Those seem like simple things, but I can see how they'd make a big difference. It's like we're intentionally counteracting those negative self-talk pattern.
That's right. And then the book takes it all a step further. It talks about how we can actually use our emotions for growth.
Oh, wow.
Instead of seeing them as obstacles, we can learn to see them as valuable signals, guiding us towards a more fulfilling life.
Okay, I'm really intrigued by that. How do we do that? Does the book have specific advice for dealing with certain emotions?
Absolutely. It gives specific advice for a whole range of emotions, like anxiety, fear, anger.
So for anxiety, what does it say?
It suggests identifying the root of the fear and then challenging those anxious thoughts. It also talks about self-care, like getting enough sleep, exercise, relaxation techniques.
Yeah, those things definitely help.
And for dealing with fear, The book really emphasizes facing it head on. Instead of avoiding it, it talks about how courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of fear.
That's so true. I think so many of us get stuck in life because we let fear hold us back.
It's a common struggle. But the book reminds us that growth often happens outside of our comfort zones.
Mm.
So if we're feeling fear, it could actually be a sign that we're on the right track, even if it feels uncomfortable.
That's a good point. What about you? Are there any emotions that you personally struggle with?
Hmm. You know, I think we all have our own personal challenges. But one thing I've always struggled with is caring too much about what other people think.
Oh, me too. It's like I'm constantly seeking their approval,
Yeah.
and it can really hold me back from being myself.
Right. It's a tough one.
Does the book talk about that at all?
It does. There's a whole section on caring what people think, and it offers some really liberating advice.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, it reminds us that other people's opinions are ultimately none of our business. We can't control what they think, so we might as well focus on living in alignment with our own values, our own truth.
I love that. It's so easy to fall into that people-pleasing trap.
Yeah, and it doesn't usually lead anywhere good. The book encourages us to shift our focus from seeking external validation to cultivating self-acceptance.
That's beautiful. It's about recognizing that our worthiness isn't based on what other people think.
Exactly. And that's really a core message throughout the book. It's about empowering ourselves to become the conscious creators of our own emotional experiences, instead of letting external circumstances or other people dictate how we feel.
I love that. So powerful. Was there any other specific advice from the book that stood out to you?
You know, the part about dealing with anger really resonated with me. I tend to bottle up my anger. Then it explodes later.
Oh, I know that feeling.
The book talks about the importance of expressing anger constructively, which is something I'm definitely still working on.
It's about finding that balance between honoring your own feelings and respecting the other person's perspective.
Exactly. The book also emphasizes the importance of forgiveness, forgiving ourselves and others. He says that holding on to anger and resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
That's a powerful analogy.
Right. Forgiveness is ultimately an act of self-care.
Totally. Speaking of negativity, a lot of people struggle with sadness and depression. Does the book offer any guidance for dealing with those emotions?
It does. It emphasizes that if you're dealing with clinical depression, it's important to seek professional help. But it also offers some general advice for those times when we're feeling down.
Like what?
Well, it talks about self-compassion.
Yeah.
Treating ourselves with the same kindness we would offer a friend who's struggling.
That's so important. It's so easy to be hard on ourselves when we're feeling down.
Right. And the book also encourages us to do things that bring us joy, even if it's something small, like listening to music, spending time in nature, or connecting with loved ones.
It's about finding those little sparks of light that can help us through the darkness.
Exactly. And the book also really emphasizes taking action, even if it's just small steps. Sometimes the best way to shift our emotional state is to just do something, anything, to break out of that cycle of rumination and inertia.
That makes sense. For me, when I'm feeling down, it helps to go for a walk or do something creative.
Yeah, movement can be so powerful.
Yeah. Like I need to move the energy.
Right. And that's a key takeaway from this book. Mastering our emotions isn't about becoming emotionless. It's about having a more conscious and skillful relationship with our emotions.
So we can actually use them to grow and live a more fulfilling life.
Exactly.
I love that. So what's next in the book?
Well, it goes on to explore several other emotions in detail and offers specific strategies for managing each one. But before we get into that, I think it's time for a little break. We'll be right back with more insights from Master Your Emotions and a thought-provoking question for you to ponder. Stay tuned. All right, so we were talking about how the book goes on to explore all these different emotions and offers specific strategies for managing each one.
Right, like anxiety and fear. We were just talking about those. But before we dive into all that,
Yeah.
I'm super curious. Did any of those techniques from the book really stand out to you?
You know what really struck me was the emphasis on emotions as signals, not sentences.
What do you mean by that?
It's so easy to get swept up in a feeling, and think like, oh, this is it. This is my life now. But the book reminds us that emotions are just messengers. They're trying to tell us something.
Oh, I like them.
And instead of judging those emotions, we can get curious about what they're trying to tell us.
Oh, okay, so it's like they're flashing a warning light on our dashboard saying, hey, something's not quite right here.
Exactly. So like, What need is going unmet? What belief is being challenged? What action do I need to take?
I love that. It puts us back in the driver's seat.
Right. Mastering our emotions isn't about becoming emotionless robots. It's about learning to work with our emotions.
So we can navigate life with more ease and resilience.
Exactly.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I thought it would be fun to leave our listeners with a question, something to really think about.
Yeah, like that.
So here it is. What one emotion, if you could master it completely, would have the biggest positive impact on your life right now?
That's a great question. It really makes you think about what you're personally struggling with.
Exactly. Maybe it's fear that's holding you back from going after your dreams. Or maybe it's resentment that's poisoning a relationship. Or maybe it's self-doubt that's keeping you stuck.
It could be anything.
Whatever it is, I encourage you to spend some time with this question, journal about it, meditate on it, talk to a friend, and then start applying what you've learned from this book to create a more empowered relationship with that emotion.
Because remember, you are not your emotions. They're just temporary visitors passing through.
And you have the power to choose how you respond to them.
Beautifully said.
Well, it's been a pleasure diving into Master Your Emotions with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listener, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive and that you feel equipped with some valuable tools to navigate the world of emotions with more confidence and skill. Until next time, happy exploring.
Okay, so where were we?
We were about to get into the specific advice for all those different emotions the book talks about.
Right, like anger, sadness, jealousy.
All the fun stuff.
Exactly.
So before we jump into that, was there any other big takeaway from the book that really stood out to you?
Well, we were talking about emotions as signals, not sentences.
Right.
And I think that's so important because it's easy to get caught up in a feeling and think, this is it, this is my life now. But the book reminds us that those feelings are temporary.
They're just messengers.
Exactly. So instead of judging ourselves for those emotions, we can get curious about them.
Like, what are you trying to tell me? What do I need to learn from this?
It's about becoming more aware of our emotional patterns.
And then using that awareness to make positive changes.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay, I like it.
Think about this. What's one emotion that if you could master it completely would have the biggest positive impact on your life right now?
Wow, that's a powerful question.
It really makes you think.
It does fear, anger, sadness.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
Take some time to really explore that question. Journal about it, talk to a friend, and then most importantly, start applying what you've learned from this book.
To create a more empowered relationship with that emotion.
Because remember, you are not your emotions.
They're just visitors passing through.
And you have the power to choose how you respond to them.
Beautifully said.
Well, it's been a pleasure diving into Master Your Emotions with you.
Likewise.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it insightful and empowering. Until next time, happy exploring.